How will Israel stop Iran from going nuclear? In 1 month? Because that's the timetable many experts are placing on Iran becoming a nuclear power. The Institute for Science and International Security, a think tank in Washington, D.C., estimates Iran will have the ability to make its first nuclear weapon in 1 month. Will Israel stop Iran? Or better yet, how will Israel stop Iran? And what does the Bible say about a nuclear Iran? Do they destroy Israel at some future point? This is Last Days News with Nelson Walters, and we're going to discuss all of that, and we're starting right now. According to the report from the Washington-based think tank, Iran can produce enough uranium for one bomb in the next month. The uranium for a second weapon would take the Islamic Republic less than 3 months to produce, and a third weapon would require 2 additional months of work. So, in 6 months, Iran could have 3 weapons. What is Israel going to do? 3 nuclear weapons is probably sufficient to take out most of the nation of Israel. So Israel must act, and act quickly. But it is not like Israel has been sitting on its hands doing nothing. They've been fighting a clandestine war with Iran for quite some time. Just this week, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Saeed Khatibzadeh, told an Israeli publication, quote, "The war with Israel has already started. Israel has carried out attacks that were intended to destroy our nuclear program for peaceful purposes. It murdered nuclear scientists and harmed the Iranian people. Iran is accused of terrorism, but there is no good or bad terrorist." Yes, he actually said that. "The whole crisis in the region is Israel's fault." End of quote. This is a very stunning admission from a top Iranian spokesman to say that Iran is at war with Israel. And allegations that Israel has sabotaged many Iranian nuclear facilities have been echoed in the Iranian press. There is no doubt that Israel counterterrorism forces are at work within Iran. And during the last week of September, a fire broke out at a secret missile facility in Iran where they have been building ballistic missiles to carry their soon-to-be-developed warheads. It was claimed that this fire was caused by the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, and there was no denial from Israel. Iran, of course, is going to strike back at this. The first place where that crisis may break out will be in Iran's Azerbaijan border area, where Iran claims there is a heavy Israeli influence and that this is the spot where Israeli forces are coming across the border and into Iran. Iran has built a heavy military influence on its northern border near Azerbaijan, who is a Turkish ally. So keep your eyes on Azerbaijan. And before we go any further, a shout out to our advisors, Fisher Mann, Michael Tarrin, Britt Ashley, Jason Lawrence, and Michael Brown for all contributing to this article because it's really an important topic. Now, all these efforts that have been going on are only Israel's Plan A. Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said in a UN speech last month that the time had come for Israel to shift to Plan B. Quote, "Iran's nuclear program has hit a watershed moment, and so has our tolerance. Words do not stop centrifuges from spinning. There are those in the world who seem to view Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons as inevitable reality, as a done deal, or they've just become tired of hearing about it. Israel does not have that privilege. We will not tire. We will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon." End of quote. Bennett is warning the world powers that Israel will not sit back and do nothing. What about the failed diplomatic efforts of those world powers? Iran just announced it will require the USA to unfreeze $10 billion of assets just to get them to re-enter negotiations. Considering Iran currently has about 5 tons of low enriched uranium, 85 kilograms of enriched purity, and another 10 kilograms enriched to the 60% range, negotiations seem, kind of fruitless. Under the 2015 deal, Iran's not supposed to have any more than just a couple hundred kilos of low enriched uranium. Will Iran really stop their efforts in the next month? Because according to military intelligence and the think tank we quoted at the beginning, Iran could decide to take all that low enriched uranium and use it, and in a month, have a nuclear weapon-grade uranium. In Israel Defense Force simulations, such a move is referred to as a, quote, declaration of war, but it does not mean that Israel will need to go to war immediately. Even with this amount of military-grade uranium, Iran would still need a little more time, the time it would take to turn uranium into uranium metal. And that's a pretty complicated process. Couple that with the assembling of a warhead installed on a ballistic missile, one that could reach Israel, it could all take about a year. Israel needs to stop that development somewhere during that period. The problem is that Israel fell behind. For perhaps 3 years after the nuclear deal was signed by the American administration, Israel essentially discarded planning to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. Back in 2010, 2012, they had extremely robust military plans. Squadrons of Israeli Air Force pilots were trained and prepared. They knew their targets and how they would get there. But with the international community engaged in diplomatic arrangements, Israel kind of recognized that such an operation was undoable. However, once the Trump administration dropped out of the agreement, serious planning resumed again. During those years when Israel's plans were on hold, Iran had time to reinforce its nuclear facilities and bolster its defenses with Russian-made anti-aircraft systems. This goes to show you how bad that original nuclear deal was. And these new defenses present challenges, but don't forget that Israel's technology has also improved. In 2012, Israel didn't have a single stealth fighter jet. It now has 30. So a military option is one possibility for Israel to fly into Iran, possibly from Saudi Arabia, and take out the nuclear facilities with bunker buster bombs. What would be Iran's response? Well, probably all-out war using their proxy nations of Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, and perhaps an invasion from the motherland as well. Drones, missiles, ground forces. And how would the UN respond? Probably to denounce Israel. Even a successful bombing raid would be a pretty risky endeavor. There is another possibility. The regime survival versus the bomb scenario. If Iran feels their government will fall if they further develop a bomb, they're going to stop. It has happened before. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei decided to suspend the project's process back in 2003 because he was fearful that Iran would be the third target of a U.S. invasion following 9/11, after Afghanistan and after Iraq. He thought maybe Iran would be third, so Iran backed down back then. But doing this now is much more difficult. The USA, Russia, and China were all convinced at that time that deterring a nuclear Iran was worth threatening a military option. Well, now China and Russia have ties to Iran, and the USA seems determined to abandon the Middle East after leaving Afghanistan. War seems the farthest thing from the USA's minds. Israel and the rest of the world are faced with two very difficult scenarios to stop Iran. But what does the Bible say about a nuclear Iran? Well, there are a couple verses that seem to have somewhat contradictory messages. Let's see if we can sort them out. First, Jerusalem survives, and sacrifices begin there on the Temple Mount, and they continue until the Antichrist invades at the midpoint of the 70th week. This is clearly pictured in Daniel 9:27, Luke 21:20 through 24, etc. And in Revelation 11:2, we learn that the city is occupied and trampled by the Gentiles for the first 42 months, or 3.5 years of the 70th week, the Great Tribulation period. So Jerusalem is not destroyed during that time. This makes sense that Iran would not destroy the third holiest site in Islam. They might invade it, but they don't want to destroy it. And the Bible supports this position. But what about other portions of Israel? Are they damaged, or are they blown up by a nuclear weapon? Isaiah 17 presents a different picture. A prophecy against Damascus. See, Damascus will no longer be a city, will become a heap of ruins. The cities of Arar will become deserted and left to flocks, which will lie down, with no one to make them afraid. The fortified city will disappear from Ephraim, and royal power from Damascus. Ephraim is northern Israel, and the cities of Aroer are in northern Jordan. And of course, Damascus is a very large city in Syria. The entire region appears to be damaged in this prophecy. Does Iran fire a nuke into this region? That's one possible scenario for the fulfillment of these prophecies. Iran is also biblically implicated in another reference in Isaiah, a very important one. A prophecy against the desert by the sea. Like whirlwinds sweeping through the southland, an invader comes from the desert, from a land of terror. A dire vision has been shown to me. The traitor betrays, the looter takes loot. Elam attack, Media lay siege. Now both of these nations existed in the current area of Iran and probably represent modern Iran in this prophecy. I will bring to an end all the groaning she has caused. At this my body is racked with pain. Pangs seize me, like those of a woman in labor. I am staggered by what I hear. I am bewildered by what I see. This is what the Lord says to me. Go, post a lookout, and have him report what he sees. When he sees chariots and teams of horses, riders on donkeys, or riders on camels, let him be alert, fully alert. And the lookout shouted, Day after day, my lord, I stand on the watchtower. Every night I stay at my post. Look, here comes a man in a chariot with a team of horses, and he gives back the answer. Babylon has fallen, has fallen. All the images of its gods lie shattered on the ground. This is the famous fallen, fallen is Babylon verse quoted in both Revelation 14 and Revelation 18 about the infamous Mystery Babylon. So Iran destroys Mystery Babylon, or at least the capital city of Mystery Babylon. And in Revelation 17, we realize it does this under the command of the beast and its 10 horns. There we learn that the harlot is burned with fire. So does Iran do this with a nuclear weapon? That seems entirely possible, if not likely. This then means that according to the Bible, Iran may become a nuclear power in the future. I mean, the Bible doesn't say that explicitly, but it seems to imply that maybe it's true. Now, Israel is currently forced on 2 parallel efforts trying to get the military ready and trying to convince the USA to present its own credible military threat. Only those options, combined with tough sanctions, will even stand a chance of getting the Iranians to stop, according to the Israeli Defense Force. But you know, Israel might not be the only Middle Eastern nation interested in taking out Iran. In fact, the Bible indicates this other nation will conquer Iran and incorporate it into its expanding empire, and that this happens prior to the Antichrist arising. Click right here to keep watching this most important end-time prophecy that is overlooked by most to find out who that nation is, what events occur prior to them defeating Iran, and the final role that Iran plays once they're part of that new empire. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.